All right, welcome to chapter 6. We have the double bishop sacrifice for you now. So this has a lot of parallels, a lot of similarities with the Greek gift sacrifice, except we're going to use two bishops, as the name implies. So here's a nice basic example of this. Here's a nice skeleton position. So here we play bishop takes h7, very similar to the Greek gift. King takes back. Now we don't have a knight. We don't have knight g5. But we do have the queen in place. We play queen h5 check, king moves back to g8, and sacrifice number 2. Here comes the second bishop, and now we've completely obliterated the king's cover. He takes, and that's pretty much the ballgame. We have queen g5 check. Very important move to throw in. It forces the king over to the h file. He now moves to h7 or h8, doesn't matter. And usually the finisher is a rook lift, rook up and over to the h file. And there's nothing here for black to do. Pawn to f6, rook h4, and we have this ladder checkmate pattern on the side of the board. So this is generally what it's going to look like. There'll be some differences. Let's take a look at the first example. And a lot of people call this the Lasker two bishop sacrifice because of this game played by world champion Emanuel Lasker. And he's playing against Johann Hermann Bauer in this game. So you can already see, if you look at the diagram, we've got our two bishops ready to go. We're almost ready for the two bishop sacrifice. This was, I think, the first time this was ever seen. And in this game, we just need to get rid of this knight on f6. So Lasker plays knight to h5. Super logical. Let's get rid of that defender. And here, when black takes on h5, now we're ready for our double bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes h7 check, just like the Greek gift. King takes back, and now queen h5 check comes in. And at this point, king g8 is the only move, and then boom, here comes the second bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes g7. And now, in this game, the king takes the bishop, and unlike in the last position, we can't play queen g5 safely because there's a bishop there, ready to take us. So we have to settle for queen g4 check, a little different. King h8, and now, if you remember, we need our rook lift. Rook to f3, rook slides over to the h file. But here, black has an interesting move. Black has a way to sort of survive. And I want you to pause your video, see if you can find anything to stop this rook h3 checkmate. And keep in mind that we've sacrificed two bishops, so we're down a lot of material here. So see if you can figure it out. All right, so defensive question here. How does black stop rook h3 checkmate? This is what black came up with. Pawn to e5, pretty much the only way. So now what does this do? Rook h3 is no longer a checkmate because we can block it. Now, black isn't happy about giving up the queen here, but remember that we're down two bishops. So after this exchange, white has to get some material back. So white doesn't get a checkmate at this point. And the end of the game is queen d7, hitting those two unprotected bishops. Queen takes b7, and we can just kind of look at the rest of the game very, very briefly. King g7, here comes the rook to help. Queen moves out of the way. Here she comes back to that g file. Open the f file for the rook, so now the rook and queen are both in action here. And then pawn e6. Just driving home that rook. Rook b7 to protect. Queen g6 attacking the pawn a third time, and this pawn is pinned. It cannot take. Pawn to f6 is played. Rook takes f6. Brutal. Bishop takes. Queen takes, and now it's queen versus two rooks, but white's got a nice tactic here. King e8. Queen goes to the back rank. Check. King e7, and now queen g7 picks up that rook on b7 with a skewer. Hit the king, king must move, grab the rook, and that was pretty much all she wrote here. Very funny finish. Queen takes d3. If rook takes, white is just up a zillion pawns. So black wanted nothing to do with the rest of this game. Now, our next example is Nimzovich versus Tarrasch. And in this game, black does the double bishop sacrifice. So here, Nimzovich, who's white, plays this move, pawn takes d4. Kind of unaware of the danger. Now this game was played after the Lasker game, so white should have been familiar with this concept, but maybe he just missed it. And at this point, Tarash, who's playing black, is able to jump in with this double bishop sacrifice that we've been looking at. Bishop takes h2, check. King takes h2, queen h4, check. And you guessed it, after the king goes back, we destroy his cover. And at this point, if white were to take this, it would be game over rather quickly. Queen g4 check, rook lift, up and over. So here white tried to kind of sneak his way out of this. He is up one bishop. He doesn't have to take the second bishop. So he tries pawn to f3 to sort of get his king out of danger, giving his king a nice little escape square on f2. So the move queen h1 check, while tempting, doesn't quite work out as well. It's not a forced mate right away. So he brings the rook in. Tarash brings the rook to the e file, cutting off the king's avenue of escape. Knight to e4, trying to keep it open. Here comes queen h1 check. King moves up to f2. Give me that rook. Pawn d5 is played. f5, trying to kick the knight away. Open up the file again. Don't let that king get away. Queen goes to c3. Notice in a lot of these games, the losing player doesn't just give up. The losing player is always trying to find some kind of trick. Queen g2 check, though, prevents queen g7 checkmate. The king has to move over onto the e file, and then look at this. Rook takes e4 check. While we're checking this king, this checkmate can't happen. Pawn takes, and now pawn to f4 check. Very, very strong. King takes, and here comes the other rook. King up to e5, and check out this finish. Very funny checkmate. Queen h2 hits all of these dark diagonal squares. King goes up to e6. Rook e8 check, and now on king to d7, see if you can find the mate in one here. Super unusual pattern. Ready? Bishop b5 checkmate. Just crisscrossing along the diagonals, deadly diagonal style. Next up, we're back with Alexander Alyekin, our world champion. We've seen a bunch of his games in this series. And he has a nice double bishop sacrifice in this position. Now, something to keep in mind. You'll see these patterns in your game. It doesn't mean it's automatically going to work. Just like with the Greek gift, you've got to really calculate this stuff out. You've got to plan ahead. Here, you probably notice the two bishops are lined up, ready to do the double bishop sacrifice. It's very tempting to just immediately play bishop h7. But here's what world champion Alyekin figured out. If bishop h7 now, king takes, and then we do the same thing, queen h5 check, second bishop sacrifices itself, and we have a problem. We actually don't have time to get this rook in fast enough. The king has too many escape squares. So for example, if we, let's say, check, okay, king can now go to the f file, not the h file. So he has time to sort of get away. And now if we try to do the rook lift, it's just too slow. It doesn't work. Maybe queen f6, and the king can start sneaking away toward the queen side. So you have to plan these things out perfectly. You have to really make sure that your attack works. So at this point, the two bishops are ready, but rook f3 is played. So we just bring that rook in a little earlier before we commit to the sacrifice, and now that rook is in position, and that makes all the difference in the world. Here, if black spots the danger, black can play something like g6 and block the double bishop sacrifice and kind of fight on here. But black just captures a free pawn, and now this is a total disaster at this point. First, white plays rook takes rook. He doesn't want, and this is another really key point, he doesn't want the black rook to capture the rook on c1 at some critical moment once the queen and bishop are gone. So he trades this rook away, gets rid of it, so there's no weakness on the back rank. And now finally, check. King takes, check again, king g8, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and actually here black resigns, but how does white finish off this attack? What does white have to do to just make this forced mate here? Pause your video, see if you can clean up the plate here. All right, so The way to finish this off smoothly is queen g4 check. And now even though the king can go to f8, we've already got our rook in position. So rook h8, game over. Okay, next example, we have Ludek Pachman versus Oleg Nikirch. And here, you probably notice, we're ready for the two bishop sacrifice. We've got our bishops in position, but we've got to calculate, we've got to make sure it works. If you play bishop takes h7 check after king takes, well, this black queen is in the neighborhood, sort of ruining everybody's good time here. So what do? Kick her out. Pawn to f4, be gone. So queen retreats to e7, and now we're in great shape for the double bishop sacrifice. He starts with bishop takes h7, king takes h7, and again, keep in mind, if the king decides to just move over here, it doesn't save him. Queen h5 is coming, and now we've got discovered checks ready to go. And this is actually even easier for white to win. So king takes is sort of the only hope here. After check, king must go back to g8, it's forced, and then second bishop sacrifices, and we're ready to go up and over with the rook if the king captures. So here, just to take a look at what that would look like, if king takes, queen g4 check, force that king over to the h file, and this rook is ready to go. Boom, he's in place. So at this point, just like in the earlier game, Nimzowitsch-Tarash, black doesn't take the second bishop. Black plays pawn to f5, trying to give his king some escape squares here. He'd be very happy if white were to take this rook. So here the bishop drops back to e5, and here there are a number of threats, and strangely black plays this move knight c4, and it just simply allows this finish. Queen to g6 check. And I think maybe black had a little bit of an optical illusion here. Maybe he thought his king would have a square to move over to, but our old friend, the bishop on the long diagonal, just covering too much ground here. And after queen g7, it's just queen next to king with a helper, and that's that. So on to the next one. Mark Taimanov versus Alexander Shashin. And again, we're all set up. We're ready for our double bishop sacrifice. Here, black plays the move pawn to b5. And let's check out the finish on this one. So you probably can guess the first couple of moves here. Take a second, but we're all set up. We have a very familiar position. Bishop takes h7, king takes h7, and here comes the queen to h5, check. King must go back, and our second bishop gets sacrificed on g7. But here we have sort of different setup. There's no rook onto the open file. There's no rook lift. We've got to figure out a way to finish this off now that these pawns are sort of blocking our path. So pause your video, see if you can find the right way to just finish off the black king here. It's a little bit of a different situation. Okay, so let's see what we came up with here. So in the game, Taimanov plays queen h6 check. So he uses the pawn, even though the pawn is blocking him, he uses the pawn as a helper. And then on king g8, we really desperately need to get our rooks in here. So pawn g6 is played. We try to open up the files. Now, an additional threat here, just queen h7 checkmate, mate in one. Queen next to king with a helper. We see this a lot. So this really forces the issue. Black plays the move knight f6 in order to try to hold on to that h7 square. It doesn't help him if he takes this pawn. Queen takes g6, king to the h file, queen h6, and now we've opened up the g file. Rook g1 check. And basically, I mean, he can block with the queen, king f7, and then another pawn helper would be the finish there. So back to the actual game. After pawn g6, knight f6 is played in order to guard that h7 checkmate. But too little too late. Taimanov just places the rook on g1, ominously threatening that king. It's not a check, but the check is coming. He's going to move that pawn out of the way. And after queen takes d5, he just pushes the pawn up a square. And this threatens mate on h8. And if, for example, knight h7, stopping the mate on h8, a really cool finish, double check promotion. Check with the rook, check with the brand new queen that you've placed on f8. Game over. Really nice finish there, pawn g7. Few more games with the same exact sacrifice. So here we have one by Tony Miles. He's playing Walter Brown in this game. And here, black plays rook to d8 and surprisingly allows this double bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes, we've seen this, king takes queen h5, king back to g8, same pattern. Check, or rather not check, check on g5. And now after king h8, we're actually going to have a little trouble doing the rook lift in this position. So we need to just be a little accurate here. We need to make sure that we don't let the king escape. So what could we play here? What could we do to try to make sure that we keep that king trapped, we don't let him get out? Take a second, see if you can accurately finish this one off. Okay, so very, very important that we play the move queen f6 first. Okay, so this just makes it so easy and efficient. After queen f6, there aren't too many good moves. I mean, he's got king g8 or king h7, and either one of those is going to be met by this rook lift, rook to c4. Now, one thing to keep in mind, you could try to do this rook lift first, but this gives black some time. And we saw this same exact defense in an earlier game. You're threatening to bring your rook to h4, but here black can open up with f6 and open the queen on the 7th rank here. And remember, we gave away 2 bishops. So even though we would end up losing a queen in this position as black, I mean, black is still in this game. He's got 2 bishops and a rook in exchange for his queen. So we have to be accurate. Queen f6 is such an important move. It doesn't allow the f-pawn to move down. King moves, rook lift, and then here black resigned. There was really no way to stop rook g4, queen g7, checkmate. Okay, so we have another Brown, different Brown. This is Wilfred Brown versus Robin Kneebone in this game. This is an interesting one. So here we're, again, almost ready, but we've got to get rid of a couple of people here. And in this position, pawn to g5 kicks the knight out. Now, very, very important here. If you know about the double bishop sacrifice, there's a way to save this knight and stop the sacrifice. So I'd like you to try to find this. This is a defensive question. Pretend you're black. You see the double bishop sacrifice coming at you. How do you defend yourself here? Okay, so here's what we have to do. We have to play the move knight to e8. Now, this is kind of an ugly looking move. Your knight is blocking your rook. He's back on the back rank. He's not developed. But importantly, it guards g7. So the double bishop sacrifice isn't going to work at this point. White is still in the driver's seat, but there's still a lot of chess to be played here. In the game, black played the move knight to d7 and just sort of walked right into this. Bishop check. Queen h5. Second bishop sacrifices itself. And we've seen this pawn on g5 before in another position. Queen h6, using the pawn as support. King g8. And very, very clever move here by white. Knight to d5. Really sneaky. It cuts the black queen off. There's no black queen defending anything anymore. The knight is threatening the bishop. Just so many good moves here. Pawn takes. And now g6. Very similar. g7, we saw this. Knight h7 and double check and mate. Super cool finish. Almost exactly like our last example. So moving along, a couple of more examples here. This one is another world championship game. So this is Judith Polgar, super strong player, very aggressive player, and she's playing world champion Anatoly Karpov, and she beats him in this game with the double bishop sacrifice. So in this position, she's just played the move rook to e3. Now we saw this in other games. We can't do the double bishop sacrifice in all situations. So she brings the rook up and she's getting ready for the rook lift before she does the sacrifice. Very good way of doing things. And here Karpov plays queen c5, kind of unaware of the danger here. He might have just missed this. Bishop h7, queen h5 check after king h7. And here Karpov realized his mistake and he actually resigned because we just have a classic double bishop sacrifice coming up. After the king moves, bishop g7, king g7. And here, a couple of ways we can finish this off. Rook check, king f6, queen g5, checkmate. So he gave it up after queen to h5. Next up, we have Moro versus Chikaidze. And this is a very, very interesting one because it doesn't end in a mate right away. But after bishop h7, king h7, and queen h5, we've seen this so many times. The bishop will take on g7, the king will take, and then here, white actually sort of missed the right way to do things. And this is something we were talking about in the previous examples. You've got to make sure that you're accurate. You've got to make sure that you look into your opponent's defensive resources. So you've got a couple of options here. You can check first, or you can try to do the rook lift first to get one of these two rooks into the game to make the attack work. So analyze both options. Do we give a check with the queen, try to force the king to the h-file, or do we make the rook lift? Take a good amount of time on this and just try to see if you can find anything that black can do to stop white's attack, whether white does the queen check or the rook lift first. So take some time. Let's see what we can find. Okay, so here in this game, white chose to give the queen check first. And now this is still fine, but after king h8, now the rook lift is not as strong. Black has this defensive resource here, knight to f6. And the idea is this. The knight on f6 stops the rook check. Once the rook goes to h3, knight h7 is played. And this is what happened in the game. Rook takes, king takes, second rook lift. But check this out. Queen d8 saves the day here. Rook check, bishop blocks. Now we can take this bishop and take the queen, but don't forget how much material white sacrificed. White gave up both bishops, white gave up rook for knight, so technically white is down in material at this point, and it's still a good game for white because black's king is open, and there's a lot this queen can do, and white did win this game, but it was just much more work than it had to be. So I want to take you back. Let's go all the way back to this check or rook lift decision here. Now, in the game, the check was played. Very logical, very reasonable, but the rook lift would have made things so much easier. Now, knight f6 just doesn't work the same way it would. We can bring the rook to g3, and the knight can't block that one. I mean, technically he can. He can go to g4, but that doesn't really help much. Just put the rook there. So the rook lift first would have made this so much simpler. So it's a very, very good lesson to learn. You've got to make sure you're accurate. You've got to make sure you think very carefully about what your opponent's defensive resources are. There's one more game, and I saved kind of my favorite one for last. This is from the game Koneru versus Nemeth. And again, we have the classic double bishop sacrifice set up, but it's sort of the finish here that I found interesting. So here, black castles right into this sacrifice. And I think black felt like the double bishop sacrifice wasn't going to work. They were, ready for it. And after bishop h7, king h7, queen h5 check, here's the deal. We can do the second bishop sacrifice like we've been doing. But now the rook lift doesn't quite work with this pawn in the path on h3. So maybe black thought they could sort of sneak out here, but not really. Now we do queen check before the rook lift. The king has to go to the h-file, and here's the finish. Rook just goes to f3 and very calmly is threatening either rook g3 or queen check first, followed by rook g3. So now rook g8 is played, trying to vacate this f8 square, trying to give the black king a little space to get through here. But queen h4 check, and then king g6. Now there's a very funny finish here. If king g7, we have the move rook g3. And here's why Koneru played rook h4, very smart on her part here. So, I'm sorry, queen h4. Because now if the king goes to f8, now all of our dreams of doing some kind of ladder checkmate on the side of the board are gone. But there's another checkmate here. See if you can find it. Pause your video. Okay, did you find the mate? Queen d8. So the queen is so powerful, she can transfer to the opposite end of the board there. We're doing everything on the king side, and now she transfers over to the center, finishes it off that way. So back to business here. The king goes to g6 instead. Rook g3, and now the king goes for a very long walk, king to f5. Now we've got to find a way to keep attacking here. If our attack runs out of steam, we're simply down 2 bishops. No good. So, queen h7, king f6, rook takes g8, and now we got back a little bit of the material. Queen a7, here comes queen h4, hitting the whole diagonal. King goes to f5, the queen chases after him on g4 here, and after king e4, queen f3, another step toward the white side of the board, king d3, queen d1 check, king takes e3, queen takes bishop on d6, and at this point, black is just down. Queen d7, or rather bishop d7, queen takes d7, and now we're up a rook. We went from down 2 bishops to being up a rook, and at this point here, black resigns. Okay, welcome to the 7th and final checkmate. This is Legal's mate. So, this is a very, very cool one. I saved one of my favorite ones for last. This is a checkmate that usually happens in the opening. I mean, pretty much, I would say almost always happens in the opening. And it involves a pin and a discovery. It's really cool. Let me show you. So the reason this is called Legal's mate, it's actually named after a French chess player whose last name was Legal. And this is the game that sort of inspired the name. So we're going to look at a lot of full chess games in this chapter because these are all super short games where this checkmate happens right in the beginning. This game is only 7 moves long. So e4, e5, knight f3, and now pawn to d6 is played. Okay, so at this point, white continues developing with bishop c4, hitting the f7 pawn. Keep an eye on that f7 pawn, very important. And now at this point, black plays bishop g4, and this is a move you'll see in tons and tons of games. The bishop just pinning the knight to the queen. The knight should not move at this point because anywhere the knight moves, black just plays bishop takes queen. I'm sure you've seen this in some of your games tons of times. White continues with knight c3. Black plays the move pawn to g6, which allows this Legal's checkmate pattern. So something to keep in mind. There are 2 main types of pins in chess. An absolute pin or a relative pin. I've also heard these called hard and soft pins, but if you pin something to somebody's king, now that piece just cannot move. But right here, the bishop's pinning the knight to the queen. So the knight can move if it wants to. It's just 99% of the time moving the knight's going to be terrible. Here, though, we have an exception. Check this out. White plays knight takes e5. So what's going on here? At this point, if black is being very, very careful and black sort of sees like, wait a minute, there's a trap here, black doesn't have to get checkmated, but black's going to be down some material. In the game, black gobbled this queen up. And the story goes, white sort of tricked their opponent into this by touching the knight and pretending to have touched it by mistake. In a chess game, when you touch a piece, you have to move it. So it seems like white was trying to hustle black a little bit here, and white touched the knight and went, oh no, and then black said, oh, it's touch move, you have to move your knight. And when knight took on e5, black snapped off that queen without thinking, and then here, white uncorked a really cool checkmate. See if you can figure out the end of the game here. Okay, so did you come up with bishop takes f7 check, now protected by this knight? Now, after king e7, which is the only move, we had to see that our second knight comes in, and now knight to d5 finishes the checkmate. Really nice pattern here. So we're going to see a few more games, all very similar. And there are a couple of different variations on this. So this next game is Falkbeer versus No Name, who we may remember. And again, full game, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4 is played. E takes d4. This is a normal opening. This is a Scotch game. Bishop c4 turns it into something we call the Scotch gambit. White doesn't recapture the pawn. White just develops. Pawn to d6, and now pawn c3. White is just trying to get every piece into the game as fast as possible. So pawn takes, knight takes, and now white has both knights and one bishop developed. And this pattern may look familiar. Bishop g4, there's that pin again. Now, here white castles. And at this point, black gets very tempted by this pin. And this is super common. And in fact, most of the time, the move that black is about to play is going to be a really good move. This knight doesn't want to move, it's pinned. So what do we do to pinned pieces? We pile up on them. We attack them over and over again. Black plays the move knight e5. And in most cases, attacking this knight with a knight will be a good idea because, like I said, the pin is pretty solid. But this is not one of those cases. Here, how does white win the game? Same pattern as last time. Take a second, see if you can find the whole sequence. Okay. Did you come up with knight takes knight, bishop takes queen, and then similar to the last game, bishop captures on f7 with check, king goes to e7, and now knight d5. Finished. Same exact finish, by the way. Both knights on e5 and d5, and the bishop on f7. Notice the king can't go to f8 because he didn't develop this bishop. Very important to develop your pieces. Okay, so number 3, we have Pillsbury of Pillsbury mate fame. Now, he's playing against Fernandez in this game, another super duper short one, another very similar example to the other two. I bet you can find this very, very quickly. So e4, e5, knight c3, knight c6, really similar. f4 is played, d6, knight f3, second knight is out. a6, a little slow, but okay. Bishop c4. So here comes that double knight and bishop combo. And you guessed it, here's the pin. So now how do we make this work? Well, Pillsbury takes on e5, sort of tempting his opponent into this whole idea of piling up on the pinned knight, which again normally does work. But in this setup, knight takes e5, big mistake. We have a really similar finish here. Pause your video, take as much time as you need. See if you can find this one, just like the other two. Okay, ready? Knight takes e5, bishop takes queen, and that same exact finish with bishop f7, king e7, and knight to d5. So both knights and the bishop are in the exact same position in all 3 of these games. Okay, so next example, we're back to our friend No Name versus Kruger, and black wins this game. Same pattern. Try to spot it. e4, d5, the Scandinavian. Pawn takes, knight to f6, not recapturing that pawn just yet. And white plays pawn to c4, trying to hold on to the pawn. Pawn to c6, trying to crack up those 2 pawns. And after takes and knight takes, black has both knights developed. Pawn to d3 is played, and now pawn to e5, center control, and here comes the bishop. So we have the 2 knights and the bishop ready to go, and there's that pin. So you can probably start to guess how this finishes. Black castles, and now white tries to pile up on the pinned knight. And I want to reiterate, this is normally a good idea. It's just the setup. It's just how white's king is so crunched up. The bishop is not developed. The king doesn't have many squares to move to. So when white tries this idea with knight e4 piling up on the pinned piece, it just doesn't work out here. What does black do? See if you can figure this out from the opposite end. How does black make the same exact checkmating pattern work in this position? So here it is. Knight takes, bishop takes queen, bishop f2, king e2, and knight d4. Same finish, just from the other side. So now this next example is going to get some other pieces involved. This is Taylor versus Dreyer, and it's going to be super similar. It's always the same type of pattern, but sometimes we have some additional pieces or extra guys coming in here. So e4, e5, bishop c4. Bishop comes out first. Knight f6, knight f3, and black here decides to take this pawn on e4, free pawn, and white develops. So now we see the same idea with both knights and one bishop in the game. So now black takes the knight. So that knight was critical to our checkmate. So that knight's going to be gone now. So now how are we going to do this? Okay, d pawn takes, which opens up the queen and the bishop. Pawn to d6, and now castles. Okay. Bishop g4. Wait a minute. We've got that pin. And again, like we talked about, normally this pin is a good idea. Piling up on the pinned piece is a good idea. But here, we've got the same sort of pattern where the f bishop has not developed. The king doesn't have the f8 square to move to. So we don't have two knights and a bishop this time. So how do we do this? Pause your video, take a few seconds, take a few minutes, see if you can figure out how this works. Okay, so the only difference here, we're missing a knight, so we're gonna have to bring in the bishop on c1 as backup. Knight takes e5, same idea. Bishop takes queen, bishop takes pawn on f7, king to e7, and then knight d5. Wait a minute, we don't have that knight. Bishop g5. And we get the checkmate along the diagonal with the bishop. Very important, black doesn't have a knight to block this or anything to take us. Game over. Nice finish here. Knight holding this square, bishop holding these two squares. No way out. Okay, world champion example here. So another quick game. This is Alexander Aliekin versus Oscar Tenner. And let's check this one out real quick. e4, e5, f4, the king's gambit, giving away the f pawn to get total center control. Bishop c5 is played, knight f3, pawn d6. Knight to c3, two knights are out, knight f6, and bishop c4. Hey, we have this same setup, but wait a minute, something's different here. The black bishop has developed, so there's an f8 square for the king to move to. So what's going to be different in this example? Let's see. Knight c6, pawn to d3, and here comes that pin, that bishop g4 idea. So here, again, this is where patterns can sometimes get dangerous. If you just jump right in without calculating and you say, oh wait, I know this one. We play knight takes e5, no problem. But then bishop takes d1, bishop takes f7, king f8, whoops, you've given up your queen for nothing. So always calculate these things out. Try to visualize it. Try to plan it in your head. So here, the world champion clearly doesn't make that mistake. He plays the move knight to a4, trying to swap knight for bishop. E takes f4. He does swap knight for bishop. Knight takes c5, pawn takes c5. Other bishop goes to f4. Here, black's looking for something similar. Knight h5 hitting the f4 bishop. The bishop simply retreats to e3. And now we have this pile up on the pinned piece idea. So here, even though we don't have the exact same pattern, we have a really similar one. So see if you can pause your video here, take all the time you need, see if you can calculate the winning plan at this point. Okay, what did you come up with? Let's see. Knight takes e5 is the start. After bishop takes d1, bishop takes f7 check. The king can move to f8 or to e7, but now, different angle of attack. We have bishop takes on c5. So we needed this backup move here to make this attack work. King f6, and castles check. Always cool when you can castle and make an attack at the same time. King takes rook on e5, and what is the finish here? Okay, see if you can find the end of the game. How does white finish this off? Okay, rook f5 checkmate. Really, really nice. Pawn defends the rook. The king can't escape due to the bishop. And the bishop on f7 is also playing a little role there as well. Every square is covered. Nice example from the world champion there. Okay, next up, Zuckertor no name. So in this game, we have e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6. Normal development here, f4 trying to chip away at the white, rather at the black center. Knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop c4. So we have knight, knight, bishop, just like we've seen in previous examples. But when black plays bishop g4, even though we know this pattern, even though we say, oh, wait a minute, I know this one, you have to make sure that your calculations are correct. You don't want to sacrifice all of your pieces and then all of a sudden realize, wait a minute, I missed a detail. So pause your video, calculate this, see if you can figure out if you can do the sacrifice yet or if you need to prepare it first. All right, so you probably guessed from my tone that knight takes e5 doesn't work here. Bishop takes d1. Just like all the other examples, we have bishop to f7 check, king to e7, and now knight to d5 checkmate. Knight takes d5, no good. So you have to make sure that your calculations are correct. The patterns are there to kind of wake you up and to say, oh, wait a minute, I know this one, I can see it, but you must calculate after that. You can't just hope for the best. So here, white just castles. Bishop e7, bishop d3, or pawn to d3 rather, knight h5, f takes, knight takes. Now wait a minute, now something's up here. Now we can make our combination work. Knight takes e5, bishop takes d1, bishop takes f7, but wait, there's king f8 in this position. So why does this work? So take a look. There's a very, very nice finish here. It uses a lot of the things from the previous chapters we've worked on. See if you can find the finish. Okay, ready? Bishop takes h5, discovery. The rook is now hitting the king. The bishop blocks on f6, but we have rook takes f6, really wild. G takes f6, and now here comes the other bishop. Look at this. These diagonals are under assault. King e7. Now here comes that knight to d5. King e6. Very cool finish here. Bishop f7. King takes e5. And there's no checkmate here. Well, not yet anyway, until white plays this move. Pawn to c3, simply threatening pawn to d4 checkmate, and there's just nothing to do. There's no way to give that king any breathing room at all. There's no way to save him. Pawn to d4 is going to finish the game. Really nice finish, really well calculated here by Zukertort. And we're on to the next one. Okay, so the next couple of examples are opening traps. Now, these aren't actual games, but I've seen these exact moves played in games. I've taught students both of these openings actually, and I've seen them happen in tournament games, but these are not famous chess master games, just little traps that happen in the opening. So the first one comes from the Sicilian defense. White plays e4 and black plays c5. So now after pawn to c3, this is the c3 Sicilian or the Alpine Sicilian, pawn to d5 is played, takes, queen takes, and now pawn d4. Fighting for the center. Trade pawns. Here comes knight to c6, and here comes knight to f3. So now we have two attackers on the pawn and two defenders. So it's very natural here to add an attacker, or like how black plays here, remove a defender. So I've seen this happen in so many games because it's just such a normal move. Attack the knight that's protecting the pawn. Very logical. But there's a problem here. White plays knight c3, kicking the black queen out. And when the queen leaves, now we have this move pawn to d5. And here, very, very tempting at this point to play the move knight e5. And you can probably guess what's going to happen here based on what we've seen in the past few examples, but calculate it out. Try to figure out the right sequence of moves. How do we make this work perfectly? Okay, pause your video, take your time, come back when you're ready. All right, so here's how this game ends. Now, there's no forced mate here, but the attack is so big that basically white ends up winning the kitchen sink. Knight takes e5, allowing bishop takes d1. Just like we've seen in every other example, we move that pinned knight. Bishop b5 check, and now this is almost mate, but there's one more move, queen d7. So now we get back the queen that we sacrificed, but we get to cash in with more material. After king d8, there's knight takes f7 check, king takes, and as tempting as it is to grab a whole free rook here, that rook's not going anywhere. So always kind of look at your options. Here, king takes bishop is just extra special. You get 3 free points, and you're going to get this rook as well. So here, it's pretty much game over. Black can play on, but it's pretty hopeless. And the next opening trap, super famous, very similar to this last one. So this is in the Queen's Gambit declined. Pawn to d4, pawn to d5. Pawn to c4 creates the Queen's Gambit, and pawn to e6 is what black usually plays here. Knight c3, knight f6, pin that knight, and now black plays the move knight to d7. And most of the time in master games or even in amateur games with pretty strong players, something like pawn e3 or knight to f6 will be played. But here white can get a little bit greedy. Pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5. And it's still not too late for white to play one of those other moves, e3 or knight to f3. But here white can get too greedy and take this pawn on d5. And again, normally an excellent idea, pile up on this pinned knight. The knight shouldn't move because it's pinned, but here, knight takes knight, bishop takes queen, and now black plays bishop b4 check. And again, it doesn't lead to a mate, but it leads to a win of material because after black gets their queen back, at the very, very end of everything, black is up an entire piece. All right, final example of the chapter, final example of the entire series. We have Mises versus Åquist. So in this game, we're going to see a couple of the things that we've looked at throughout all of the steps, all of the chapters. Let's jump right in here. So this is e4, d5, the Scandinavian. After takes and queen takes, knight c3 attacks the queen, and the queen retreats all the way back to d8. Pawn to d4 is played, knight c6, here comes knight f3, both knights are out, and now here is that pin. After pawn d5 though, the black knight is kicked off of c6, and it goes to the exact wrong place. Knight to e5, piling up on that knight, but failing to notice the tactic here. And we saw something so similar to this in our prior example with the c3 Sicilian. So pause your video, see if you can figure out how white finishes off this game. It's game over in just a few more moves. Okay, so here is what white does. Knight takes knight, as you may have guessed, giving up the queen like we've seen so many times. But why though? We have to have a follow-up, we have to calculate it perfectly. Bishop b5 check. Now, after pawn c6, it looks like black is sort of escaping here. But here comes pawn takes, and if the pawn recaptures, now bishop c6, and you have a very similar setup where you're going to win the queen, you're going to make a fork, and you're going to take this bishop on d1 and grab the rook. We saw this in the c3 Sicilian trap. So black tried to be a little clever here and play the move queen c7, but now we're back to our old friend from the first chapter, discovered check. The bishop is hitting this king, pawn takes b7 check, king to d8. Did you find the final move here? Did you get to this point? What's the last move? How do we finish the game? How do we checkmate here? Knight takes f7. The bishop attacks all the white squares on the a4 to e8 diagonal, and the pawn attacks c8. There's nowhere for this king to go. Game over, checkmate. All right, congratulations are in order. You made it through the 7 even deadlier checkmates. So your work is not done. I want you to go through this course again. Do it as many times as you want to. You want to internalize all of this information, be able to use it in your games. You want it right at your fingertips. You want to be able to see these combinations quickly and use them to defeat all of your chess opponents. Now, if you like this video, leave a note, leave a message. I'd be happy to make more. Looking forward to seeing you in the next one.